I want to, first of all, thank a couple of people. First of all, I want to thank Christina Bascom for sponsoring this open talk. So thank you, Christina. And I also want to thank Jerry James for writing the essay that accompanies this. A number of you came in and saw the picture of Richard Nixon and wondered if you were in the right place. It's good. I am thrilled to have made the acquaintance of Jen Croissant. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She's an associate professor in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona. She's originally from a small town in Pennsylvania and moved to Tucson after completing her PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Yes. Does somebody else go there too? No. Okay. She has been in Tucson for almost 25 years. Her current teaching includes science fiction studies and a general class on technology and society. She is the co-author with Rudy Volti of the upcoming textbook Society and Technological Change. Recent publications include studies of time and interdisciplinarity and agnotology, which is studies of ignorance and non-knowledges.
All right.
Teaching science fiction is the best gig ever. Reading as much SF as she can and calling it work. Other hobbies include coaching pole vault and other track and field events for South Point Catholic High School and Pole Pilots Track Club, the latter with her spouse. Jen will talk to us for a while, and then we'll have a scene from the play, and then we'll come back up here and answer questions that you have about anything. So, without any further ado, Jen Croissant.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Cynthia for managing associate director here for the invitation to speak at the Rogue Theater today, and thank you all for coming out on such a lovely fall afternoon. James provided, I think, a really nice essay there, I just got to speed read it, about what's happening in 1969, providing some context for the original publication of this as a novel. I'm going to talk today about Ursula Kroeber Le Guin, the writer. I will start with a brief biography and then focus on three topics. Le Guin as an anthropological writer, particularly as our galactic anthropologist in the case of Left Hand of Darkness. I will then talk about the plot and general impact of Left Hand of Darkness at the time of its production and into the present, and focusing on the gender dynamics of Left Hand of Darkness. I will then conclude with some thoughts about Le Guin as an anti-utopian writer who nonetheless wrote relentlessly about hope and the role of the arts in transforming society. Throughout this talk, I will focus on Le Guin's work, which is most identified as science fiction, and mention a few of her other works which share ideas and provide examples of themes and the structure of Left Hand of Darkness. So let's start with the basic biography. Ursula Kroeber Le Guin was born October 21st, 1929, and passed away January 22nd, 2018, aged 88. She was the daughter of anthropologist and founder of the Cal Berkeley Department of Anthropology, Alfred Kroeber, and Theda Krakow, a novelist and anthropologist. Le Guin received her MA in French from Radcliffe College, Columbia University in 1952. She married Charles Le Guin, historian of France, particularly the French Revolution. They met, it is said, on the Queen Mary on a trip to France in 1953, where she was going to undertake a Fulbright in support of her PhD. As expected at the time, however, she dropped out of her PhD program to follow her spouse to his graduate school, Emory, and eventually to his employment in Portland, Oregon. She had worked as a secretary until the birth of her first daughter in 1957. So Le Guin had an anthropological childhood with her faculty parents. What's that mean? Her household was filled with visiting anthropologists at dinner and engagement with her own parents' anthropological study of the indigenous peoples of California. She explicitly acknowledges the dimensions of indigenous thought, which informs her writing, and in many places of her nonfiction writings reflected on her childhood summers at a ranch which hosted visiting scholars, students, and native Californians. Other factors influencing her writing and her anthropological orientation include her attention to religion and belief as an anthropologist. She was resolutely a-religious and sort of an idiosyncratic Taoist, and influenced largely by Jungian psychoanalysis. So it is easy to see how balance, symmetry, and the arc of the seasons shape her world building across her fictional works. Her work is also very deeply ecological and situated in place. For example, The Dispossessed is in 1974 is the exploration of a communitarian, Taoist, anarchist society through the character of a physicist who invents an instantaneous communication device called the Ansible. For those of you who are deep readers in science fiction, she's probably the progenitor of that term, the Ansible, that shows up through generations of sci-fi writers. The Ansible opens up the universe to intergalactic travel. For The Dispossessed, the moon colony and Anares is a society of intentional emigres, self-exiled from the hyper-capitalist home planet, Uras, and its unethical society. The fragility of life on the moon planet Anares is due to its very hostile climate, and an ongoing famine produces conflict, yet spurs a recommitment to mutual aid, because without such praxis, mutual aid, the society would not survive. So the constraints of geography and climate influence the social organization, a basic anthropological insight. More directly, in terms of her ideas about place, her very famous short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, 1973, slyly references Salem, Oregon, if you're looking at it in your rearview mirror. Omelas, Salem, right? Her understandings of the ecological and cultural devastation of colonialism in California, and perhaps the influence of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 with the nascent environmental movement, plus her deep love of the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, inform much of her work, such as her monumental Always Coming Home. So Le Guin first published in 1959. As she entered her writing career in the late 1950s, feminist and related social justice movements were on the rise. For example, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963. She used her lived experience of mothering to inform many of her works, never neglecting the work of care and family. She also expressed a public commitment to bodily autonomy. For example, sharing an account about her abortion. She had an abortion for an unplanned pregnancy in her late teens, and she said that allowed her to receive her education and to eventually marry and have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Otherwise, she would have been trapped as an unwed mother in the early 1950s. In the 1980s, she crafted an identity for herself as a public intellectual, taking positions on writing, politics, the publishing industry, eventually on Amazon and its influence on publishing, and the literary politics of genre, boundaries, and awards. We would need another hour to track her responses to being labeled a sci-fi writer. Like Margaret Atwood and Marge Piercy, she resisted being pigeonholed. But not because she was a genre snob, but because she wanted to think of herself as a writer. For the time being, I'm going to talk about science fiction and speculative fiction as SF. When forced to pin herself to a genre or style, she self-proclaimed on occasion to be a woman writer, on occasion, a Western writer, and an American novelist. Right? She wrote 23 novels in science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction. She also did translations, books of poetry, books for children, and books about writing. While much is made of her anthropological upbringing, she herself made note of her formal training in languages. Perhaps it was maybe influential that she had a master's in French. A lot of people went straight for the anthropology. She actually was very concerned about language. Like her poetry, her language training is often overlooked in assessments of her works. Similarly, her translations, such as the Tao Te Ching in 1997, are rarely engaged.
Wow.
Her writing trajectory exceeded the boundaries of genre established by the literary establishment, publishers, and booksellers. All right, so we will focus here, though, on the works identified as science fiction, SF, rather than the works such as the Earthsea books, which are often identified as fantasy. For the record, Le Guin received many awards. 8 Hugos, 6 Nebulas, 22 Locus Awards, a Gandalf and a Kafka Award, and a National Book Award. After passing in 2018, she was much mourned by very many literary luminaries and science fiction fans. She was heralded as, to quote writer Michael Chabon, the greatest American writer of her generation. And the late literary scholar and cultural curmudgeon Harold Bloom, who is not known for his expansive view of the literary canon, made much note of her exquisitely crafted and imaginative work. Towards the end of both of their lives, he was thinking about producing an anthology of her poetry. So, for those new to Le Guin's work, and who are new, we have lots of people, perhaps you were thinking, why haven't I heard of her? Right? The short answer to the question of why have I not heard of her is that her work does not have very many incendiary explosions. Few robots, only a smattering of spaceships are ever explicitly described. It is not made for TV, although there have been a few rather odd attempts. One with Lisa Bonet, they're just very strange. There are very few interstellar battles, right? But Le Guin produces explosions in the mind. So, as sci-fi author Frederick Pohl is said to have argued, a good science fiction story should be able to predict not the automobile, but the traffic jam. We can look at the presence of one or more nova, or novum, which are points of difference rooted in alternative understandings of the universe as nova, the delta in an equation. What's the difference from our present? In hard science fiction, it is often about gadgets and new technologies. In the so-called soft science fiction, it is often more elaborate what-if game, rooted in scientific and cultural alterities. SF is a literature of ideas, or at least the best SF, in my opinion, is a literature of ideas, not just explosions. Le Guin's work in any genre are about being in the world. It's about relationships, language, place, and ecology. Her works are, again, across the board about culture and the relationships between technological systems and cultures. So Le Guin is our galactic anthropologist. With language, culture, place, and relationships defining Le Guin's work as anthropological, her anthropology is, again, you'll see it in the play, I hope, and her formal training in languages are central to Left Hand of Darkness in nearly all of her works. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to walk through a couple of the major points of the novel which make it distinctly anthropological to help provide some context for the upcoming scene. Left Hand of Darkness was Le Guin's fourth novel in 1969. It is part of a loosely styled Hainish cycle, nerd alert here, a universe where humans did not evolve on Earth, but were colonized by the Hain peoples long, long ago. You can finish that in a galaxy far, far away if you like. After centuries of non-contact, all of the different colonies that had been settled by the Hain differentiated themselves with new genetic traits, either through natural selection or perhaps through experimentation. Right, so whenever in the past, the Hain populated all these different planets, which then adapted different strategies to engage their ecology, to be able to survive as beings. So our primary character is Genli I, who is literally an anthropologist. He's assigned to the planet Gethen, also known as Winter, and he is there alone to present an invitation to join the Ecumen, a loose intergalactic association. The Ecumen is sort of a galactic NGO with no military and not much formal authority except with regards to its emissaries. So the emissaries, such as Genli I, have a lot of rules on what to do and what not to do. Envoys appear alone, so they're not threatening. But coming alone also allows Genli I to be dismissed as a fraud and as part of various conspiracies. Gethen is currently either in an ice age or is icebound with mild seasonal thaws. In either case, it is merely inhospitable. Behind the scenes of the novum of an ice planet are interstellar travel and suspended animation, which allow for a crew to be resting behind the sun to pick up Genly I when his mission is done. All right, so that's the sort of planetary context of this. But the primary novum of this text is the erasure of gender. Except for a brief monthly period of reproductive activity, people live their lives without a fixed gender or without sex and gender distinctions. A person could father a child at one point in their life, but mother a child later in life. Some identify this as ambisexuality. When not sexually active, people are androgynous. Right? It is suggested and hinted at that the absence of sexual dimorphism on Gethen was the result of genetic engineering in the human diaspora. So this gives us, big spoiler alert, the mind explosion. The king is pregnant. Think about that statement in 1969. Genly I, coming from standard human stock, finds this genderlessness baffling and consistently misreads and generally underestimates his interlocutors, including the character Estraven, the prime minister for the nation of Karhide. Right? And that is his primary point of contact and his primary relationship for communicating with this one nation to try to get them to join the ecumen. The androgyny of the Gethenians reads as effeminate to Genly I, and coupled with very indirect modes of communication, he finds them untrustworthy. As Genly I is tall, dark-skinned, or even black, and a permanently male figure, he too is misread and often treated with contempt or even disgust. He is called a freak. While he himself, through the narrative, is unfailingly honest, we see this as a reader, he is often read by the Gethenians as untrustworthy. Right? So, the nation of Karhide is a monarchy, and is one of the two organized nation states on Gethen or Winter. As a monarchy, social interactions are highly constrained by unstated social rules and formal courtesy. Everyone's worried about being a court. Speech is very indirect, and face saving is a key element of smoothing out social interactions. And on top of that, the king of Karhide might just be insane. The court turns over frequently, there are lots of schemes and plots. So Estraven, our prime minister and point of contact, is accused of treason. Because of his association with Estraven, Genly I becomes suspect, and he needs to decamp to the neighboring nation of Orgorein. I'm not sure about that one. Which is a faction-driven bureaucratic nation. Superficially, he has a better reception in Orgorein. But through various machinations amongst competing factions, Genly I ends up in prison and comes to near death in a forced labor camp. Estraven rescues Genly I, and they return to Karhide in an 80-day trek across ice fields and hard terrain. They are tested and learn a platonic love for each other, stripped down on the ice fields to the most essential and human and non-gendered characteristics needed to survive: persistence, honesty, prudence and wisdom, and self-sacrifice. Ice figures throughout the novel as stasis, an idea about immovable reality, which is a hard anvil against which the characters are tested. It also represents the stasis of the political systems, each deeply flawed and eventually destabilized by Genly I's rescue. When Genly I disappeared, he was like a social media figure, right? His disappearance was explained with lies and cover-ups. His reappearance, of course, blows all of that up, an explosion of sorts, and incites reform, if not revolution. He eventually calls upon the waiting starship, and the return of that starship and team is an empirical demonstration of the reality at the ecumen in the minds of the nations of Gethen, and it seals the deal. And, towards the end, spoiler alert, the nations of Winter join the ecumen. So what's really interesting is having to context deeply personal relationships within large-scale political struggles. So let's talk about the structure of the novel. It's framed as a report from Genly I back to the ecumen. The narrative structure of the novel reflects Genly I's own learning. It contains ethnological materials from an earlier observer, including songs, poems, myths, and legends of Gethenian folklore. It looks like the notes of an anthropologist cataloging a newly engaged culture. Guin uses a similar but more developed anthropological notebook model in the book Always Coming Home, which I'll talk about at the end. So Genli is a galactic anthropologist, and through his struggles to understand this alien culture, it provides a mirror back to his own, our own, assumptions, experiences, and culture. Le Guin's galactic anthropologist faced exile, was committed to exploration, and faced multiple crises of ethics. I don't know for sure, but the timing is pretty good, that this appears after the end of the first run of the original Star Trek, right, with the Prime Directive, which was inconsistently applied, but nonetheless prevented interfering with the natural development of contact planets, right? But it does present at least a semblance of choice to the new cultures the ecumen might want to engage. So the ecumen is not a direct extractive colonialism, but it does seek to exchange information. So, let's think 1969 through 1972. Left-Handed Darkness was immensely impactful following publication. It won the Nebula Award, which is from sci-fi writers and editors, as well as a Hugo, which is selected by fans. People and all of the things writing about the book at that time made note of a number of dimensions that made it innovative and worthy of awards. The most straightforward of these is the technical merits of its writing. Le Guin had a unique voice and was noted across her career for rhythm, exactitude of prose, and multi-level associations and cultural references, which made her work both dense and vivid. The second was the non-standard format. So there is a solid narrative with proper amounts of conflict and resolution to satisfy a conventional reader. The use of poetry, notes, folklore, as encapsulated in anthropologist notes and notebooks, was innovative. This technique and styling creates a deep mythopoesis, and I'll explain that in a second, that represented the cultures of Gethen as complex and as no more or less consistent than our own taken for granted cultural formations. So, mythopoesis is the construction of mythology and folklore for an invented culture. So, Tolkien, of course, set the standard for that, pretty high bar. So he not only laid out the terrain of Lord of the Rings, for example, but he also backstopped each culture with languages, beliefs, stories, songs, mythologies, histories, right? So the elves, dwarves, and men all had their own folklore. For Le Guin, her world building included the what if of science fiction created by creating a world without gender. As well, though, and important to note, she was also very early in the science fiction world engaging as normal and almost unremarkable a non-white character, which shifted reader interactions. In the case of Genli, his darker skin pushes the stereotypical white male science fiction reader to identify with the Gethenians who found his skin color odd. So instead of identifying with the anthropologist or having to go back and forth, am I reading as Genli? Am I reading as a Gethenian who finds him strange? It provides an interesting dynamic in reading the text. The normalization of difference was radically other to the real world of the expected sci-fi reader of the 1960s, which was basically white male. When Left-Handed Darkness emerged, science fiction was at the end of its golden age of what is known as hard science fiction, featuring the best and worst of amazing stories where men were men, and a ray gun was just a ray gun, and women were limited to a small number of tropes such as spinster scientist, plucky tomboy, and of course the chronically underdressed damsel in distress. So Left-Handed Darkness was part of what would become to be identified as the new wave of SF. You don't know that you're in a new wave until you're after the new wave, but looking back, that's what we identify it as. It incorporated minoritized voices and perspectives, including a multiplicity of feminist writers, writers of color, and LGBTQ writers. Figures such as, I can go on with this, Tiptree, Piercy, Starhawk, Atwood, Rice, Charnas, Butler, and especially Samuel Delany took inspiration from Le Guin as they followed her lead into these spaces which explored alterity and disrupted the nostalgia in science fiction, which normalizes the real world. Science fiction is a mirror genre which reflects back to the reader the current state of the world. The novum has to differ from us in some way. It also is a literature that reflects cultural anxieties about science and technology. For example, the original Spider-Man was caused by a radioactive spider, reflecting Cold War concerns. More recent spider people have been caused by genetically engineered spiders, or alien spiders, reflecting concerns about emerging genetically engineered things in our world, and aliens as both real and metaphoric concerns about national boundaries. So, back to the SF of the New Wave. It echoed the emergent struggles of the nascent feminist, racial justice, and environmental movements. All human work is a product of its time, place, and culture. Each era of science fiction is no less. There are two dimensions to the what-if of the non-gendered world of Gethen that reflect early feminist concerns. The first is anti-essentialism. It is an early recognition of the social construction of difference between male and female bodies and the social roles and identities which become attached to them. Right? It makes much note of the ways that we are really, really much more alike than different, and that even biology is not as binary as people are accustomed to thinking. These two insights, social construction and the sex-gender continuum, produced intense feminist approval for Left Hand of Darkness in the early 1970s, but there were critics. Le Guin chose to use he as the universal pronoun, not finding neopronouns of the time working for her stylistically. So as de Beauvoir and other feminist writers have noted, male is an unmarked category, as is whiteness in Western society. The default option when presented with a human person is the unstated norm against which all non-men are other or special interests. Consider Ruth Bader Ginsburg's quip when asked about the appropriate number of female Supreme Court justices. She said, "You know, when I'm asked when there will be enough women on the Supreme Court, I always say when there are 9, and people are shocked." But there'd been 9 men, and nobody ever raised an eyebrow about that. So men are the unmarked category. De Beauvoir gives us a nice quote. In the midst of an abstract discussion, it is vexing to hear a man say, "You think us and so because you're a woman." But I know that my only defense is to reply, "I think thus and so because it is true," thereby removing my subjective self from the argument. Again, men are the norm from which all others deviate. Unfortunately for Le Guin, the use of pronouns in Left Hand of Darkness reproduced that kind of erasure of women as women and things that are feminine. Similarly, in Left Hand of Darkness, what we would call women's work and the labor of care is effaced. It's kind of not visible in the novel. We hear about it only obliquely. She changes this, though. So, of course, in 1969, Left Hand of Darkness made waves. The king is pregnant. By the 1980s, there were special issues of science fiction studies, scholarly journals, and trade publications about Le Guin, often incorporating interviews. She was much anthologized. Reissues of her works, including Left Hand of Darkness, appear regularly. In the afterword of the 25th anniversary edition of the novel, she stated that her opinion on the matter of pronouns had changed. She was haunted and bedeviled by the matter of pronouns. However, she saw it untruthful to the work to try to revise it. She also later reflected on the problems of colonialism and the anthropological experiences in her childhood. Although she did not live to see the unnaming of Kroeber Hall in Berkeley, she did acknowledge the impossible contradictions of anthropological work and colonial relations. Left Hand of Darkness remains salient and impactful, recommended one reader to another as younger generations move into their writing careers. At the 50th anniversary of Le Guin's first published short story in 2012, writer Julie Phillips identified the generations of writers who recounted Le Guin's influence on their work. Of course, at Le Guin's death in 2018, writers of her generation and younger authors, such as Becky Chambers or Anne Leckie, noted the impact of Left Hand of Darkness as an example of what-if thinking. For some readers, Left Hand of Darkness changed everything. It changed who they thought they were, what they thought was possible to write. It was a mind explosion that opened their imaginations. If you're unfamiliar, in Becky Chambers' work, there are multiple species, and not every species even needs a gender. So there's no binary. Her works are really amazing. Anne Leckie invited an empire where all persons are referred to with she or her, no matter their biology or social role. Leckie's work truly offended sci-fi traditionalists, troglodytes, and trolls. So, I'm going to conclude here with some comments about Le Guin as an anti-utopian author. An anti-utopia is not a dystopia. Although we get glimpses of dystopias in dysfunctional societies in her work, and her stories are an always implicit or even explicit critique of the societies of our time, her time, even her most utopian gestures remain cognizant of the limits of human nature, the problems of stasis and change, and the aggregation of power. So in Le Guin's framework, utopias just can't work. In Left Hand of Darkness, neither monarchies nor bureaucracies will save us. In The Dispossessed, communitarian anarchism is hard work, but much to be preferred to rapacious capitalism. But there's still interpersonal conflict, and the communitarian syndicates require periodic renewal to prevent the coagulation of power and the abuse of power by individuals to advance personal goals. I highly recommend The Lathe of Heaven, deeply Taoist book. Every dream fulfilled has unintended and unavoidable consequences and contradictions which cannot be avoided, but only measured in relation to empathy and knowledge. In the present, we definitely don't believe in utopias. As she notes in her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, happiness is banal in literature, and conflict is central to our ideas about a good narrative. It's assumed to be an indelible part of our interpersonal and international relations. A society without violence, without war, without gender is unimaginable. But things change. Seasons turn, people learn, grow, and die. Anything that presumes stasis is unsustainable. Time passes, and stability, is not possible nor desirable. One of the things I'm currently enamored of Le Guin about is her take on aging, wisdom, and letting go. In the scholar, agitator, revolutionary Odo, who is an ancestor to the philosophy of the dispossessed, part of this Hainish cycle, does not get to see her revolution take shape. Le Guin writes cogently about gray hair, menopause, and the wisdom of elders who must necessarily step back from, yet provide wisdom to, youth movements. For those of us who know with certainty that we have more birthdays behind us than ahead of us, she models both graceful aging and the need to let go, and the need for society to care and respect for its elders. Inevitably, change produces conflict. Context change, ecologies change, people change, institutions change, and these shape priorities, values, and necessities. But despite the inevitability of human conflict, Le Guin, as our galactic anthropologist, holds mirrors up to ourselves, and she was hopeful. She was hopeful because we have imaginations. She noted in an interview that science fiction helps me to get people out of their cultural skins and into the skins of other beings, not just people, other beings. This is both deeply anthropological and deeply empathetic. Jen Lee I, our galactic anthropologist in Left Hand of Darkness, demonstrates the need for cultural self-examination as a part of establishing empathy. It's not just how do I know or how do I feel, but how is my culture shaping that knowledge and feeling, and how might I do, be, think, feel otherwise? Le Guin repeatedly, in her nonfiction and fiction, writes about the need for artists to imagine otherwise. For example, she was accepting the National Book Foundation contribution to American letters, and she lamented the commercialization of art and its narrowing of the imagination. Here's her quote: "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then so do the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art." very often in our art, the art of words. While that particular speech was directed at the ways that corporate machinations stifle innovations in literature in the name of sales, she writes elsewhere of the necessity and power of art to think otherwise, and more generally. Scholar and writer Grace Dillon, Anishinaabe Native American, who edited the first collection of science fiction, indigenous science fiction, writes, "If you are thinking of something, you can be willing it into being. It actually can come about." She argues that Le Guin's fiction matters in the world. The passage of stories from person to person could foment new ways of life. As demonstrated by our experiences of the pandemic, it was both science, which provided the backbone of our potential recovery from it, and art and cultural production, which have taken the edge off the isolation and despair of the epidemic experience. The arts are necessary. They are not just frills. Science fiction is a literary genre, and here, essential to the theatrical enterprise, can be one of the places where we work on what we want the future to become. So I'm going to give you the first line of Le Guin's experimental novel, Always Coming Home, which I mentioned at the beginning. Any English teachers or grammar nerds here? All right. The people in this book might be going to have lived a long, long time from now in Northern California. Did your mind explode? Did you feel the tenseness of that sentence? Might have been going to have lived a long, long time from now. So what she's asking in that first sentence of the book is, what work do we owe the future to bring possible worlds into being? I think the better our galactic anthropological knowledge and imagination, the more possible and sustainable our potential futures. In that quest, there is no better model than Le Guin. Left Hand of Darkness asks us to think about what real equality might mean. It is not just possible or desirable, but essential to dispense with gender ideologies and gender expectations, to be able to see each other as full human persons of value, autonomy, and dignity. The thought experiments of Le Guin's SF and some of her fantasy are examples of the kind of imaginative work that needs to be done to bring new futures into being. And so I am done, and thank you for your forbearance. And I hope this talk hasn't been too academical. And I really appreciate this assignment from Cynthia because it allowed me to do a really deep dive into the writings by and about Le Guin. I hope I've given you some insights into this production. And for those of you who are new to Le Guin's work, go immerse yourself in her work. Go read. Let your mind explode. And for those of you,
I'd like to welcome to the stage Joe McGrath as King Argivan and Kevin Ausu as Genly I. Enjoy.
Say what you have to say, Mr. I.
My lord, what I have to say has gone out of my head. I have only just heard of Lord Estrevin's disgrace.
Damn. Estrevan. Posturing, perjuring traitor. You dined with them last night? And Estrevan told you what a powerful person they are and how they run the king and how easy you'll find me to deal with since they've been talking to me about you. Huh? Is that what Estrevan told you, Mr. I? I'll tell you what Estrevan's been saying to me about you. They've been advising me to refuse you audience. Maybe pack you off to Orgarine or the islands. All this half month, Estrevan's been telling me. It's Estrevan that got packed off to Orgarine.
I can only ask, my lord, if I am to be considered implicated in Estrevin's crime.
You? No. Sit down, Mr. I. Sit down. I don't know what the devil you are, Mr. I. A sexual freak, or an artificial monster, or a visitor from the domains of the void, but you're not a traitor. You've only been the tool of one. I don't punish tools. Trust no one. Damn! That lying, cold-blooded traitor. I trusted Estrevan. I I'd put the silver chain round their damn neck. I wish I'd hanged them with it. Give it. Say what you have to say, Mr. I.
The Ecumen want an alliance with the nations of Gethen.
What for?
Material profit, increase of knowledge, the augmentation of the intensity and the complexity of the field of intelligent life, the enrichment of harmony and the greater glory of God, curiosity, adventure, delight.
How big is this kingdom out in nowhere, this Ecumen?
There are 83 habitable planets in the ecumenical scope, and on them about 3,000 nations.
3,000?
3
1 against 3,000?
3,000 nations on 83 worlds, sir. The nearest to Gethen is 17 light years away in ships that go at near light speed.
17 years?
Yes, sir. If you thought that Gethen would suffer from harassment from such neighbors, consider the distance at which they live. Forays across space are worth no one's trouble. Trade, however, is worthwhile.
What sort of trade?
Trade in ideas and technologies and goods and artifacts. Ambassadors, scholars, merchants. Some of them might come here. Some of yours might go off-world. The Ecumen isn't a kingdom, but a coordinator, a clearinghouse of trade and knowledge. Men's lives are too short to cope with the time jumps if there's no centrality, no network. Therefore, they become member of the Ecumen.
Men, you say?
Yes. We are all men, humans, you know, sir. All of us. All of the worlds of men were settled eons ago from one world. Hey, we vary, but we're all brothers of the same heart.
Are they all as black as you?
Some are blacker. We come all colors.
What's this?
It is a person from Sime, a female.
Permanently?
Yes.
So, they're all like that, like you?
Yes. Sir, your sexual physiology, Gethenian sexual physiology, so far as we know, is unique among human beings.
So, all of them out there on these other planets are in permanent kemmer? A society of perverts? It's a disgusting idea, Mr. I. I don't see why human beings here should want any dealings with creatures so monstrously different. But then, perhaps you're here to tell me I have no choice in the matter?
The choice for Carhide is yours, sir.
And if I send you packing?
Then I'll go. I might try again with another generation.
Are you immortal?
No, not at all. But the time jumps have their uses. If I left Gethen now for the nearest world, I'd spend 17 years getting there. If I simply turned around and came back, my few hours on the ship would here amount to 34 years, and I could start all over.
You want me to believe you, your tales and messages, but why need I believe? Oh, listen. If there were 80,000 worlds full of monsters out there among the stars, what of it? We want nothing from them. We've chosen our way of life and have followed it for a long time. Carhide's on the brink of a new epoch, a great new age. We'll go our own way. And if there were anything these ecumens wanted from us, they wouldn't have sent you alone. It's a joke, a hoax. Aliens would be here by the thousand.
But it doesn't take 1,000 people to open a door, my lord.
It might, to keep it open.
The Ecumen will wait for you to open it, sir. They will force nothing on you. I was sent here alone, and I remain here alone in order to make it impossible for you to fear me.
But I do fear you, envoy. I fear those who sent you. I fear liars. I fear tricksters. And worst, I fear the bitter truth. And so I rule my country well, because only fear rules. Nothing else works. Nothing else lasts long enough. I am already afraid, and I am the king. Fear is king. Now take your traps and tricks and go. There's no more need saying. I have ordered that you be given the freedom of Carhide.